Ron Black, Ronnie to his friends and family, was studying the map in front of him, but his mind was not on his work. He was thinking about what he had been told that day about Nancy, his wife of 2 years. He thought he had had a good life, which included a beautiful, loving wife. But it had all come crashing down as recently as 2 hours ago. "I'm sorry to tell you this, but your wife is cheating on you," Bill Jacobs had told him while sipping a beer at a bar near the pharmaceutical company where he worked as a researcher. Ron didn't just consider Bill a coworker and respected colleague, he considered him a friend. "How do you know?" asked Ron. Bill took a sip of his beer before continuing. "I heard a couple guys in the lab talking about it in the men's room," said Bill. "They were bragging about taking it at the last company gathering." "Damn," Ron said. That explained a lot. The company liked to throw regular parties for employees and their spouses in the newly rebuilt employee lounge, a huge room with a stage for a band to play, and a giant flat-screen monitor to show movies. It also served as a break room during normal business hours. The last meeting had taken place just 2 weeks ago. For about 2 hours, Nancy was nowhere to be found. When she finally showed up, she stated that someone had given her a tour of the place. "I'm sorry, friend," Bill said. "I thought you should know." "Thanks, Bill," Ron said quietly. "You're a true friend." "You're welcome," Bill said. "I know if it were me, I'd want to know. Just don't do anything stupid." Ron laughed. Stupidity was the last thing Ron could be accused of. Ignorant, maybe even a little naive about some things, but in no way stupid. "I won't," he told his friend. Bill finished his beer and put his hand on his friend's shoulder as he stood up. "If there's anything I can do to help, let me know," he said before walking away. Ron nodded his head and took another sip of his beer. While he mulled over what Bill had said, he took inventory and thought about his life, replaying it in his head like a movie. Ron was below average in almost every physical parameter. At 5 feet 7 inches tall, he was 2 inches shorter than the average man in the United States and weighed about 145 pounds. His body had never fully formed, and as a result, he was physically weaker than most men of his age and size. When you add to this his generally mild temperament, you can see why most people's first impression of him was that he was a weakling. You could count on the fingers of one hand the number of times he lost his temper, and even then, most of the time he just walked away. All his life, his loved ones took advantage of his small stature, slight build, and quiet manners. His two brothers, John and George, loved to tease and bully him. His sister Lisa, who was only a year older than him, often joined in, but was never as cruel as his older brothers. Even his parents mocked him and made him feel like less of a man. "Why can't you be like the other boys?" his mother June asked him when he refused to go out with his brothers. "Because I am not like the other boys," he would reply. "Why can't they be like me? Why can't they try reading a book once in a while instead of always chasing a ball?" The only one in his family who didn't scold him was his grandfather, Mark Black. Ron loved to visit this elderly man who had the largest personal library Ron had ever seen. By the age of 12, Ron had read all the books in his grandfather's ever-growing library. The one he enjoyed most was Robert Louis Stevenson's classic story, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, written in 1886. It always amazed him that people were often wrong about the story. He also loved to read books about science and devoured everything he could find on the subject. While other kids his age were agonizing over Dick and Jane, he was reading War and Peace and treatises on biochemistry. His grandfather saw something in Ron that no one else did and paid for an IQ test. When the results came back, he was amazed. With an IQ of 215, he beat out Albert Einstein and Stephen Hawking. Ron wasn't just a genius, he fell into the classification of immeasurable geniuses. With Ron's test results in hand, Mark paid to have the young man tested for admission to Mensa, even though he was well below the minimum testing age of 14. Mark and Ron celebrated with ice cream and cake when he was accepted into the organization. He certainly wasn't the youngest to be accepted, but he was very young. For the first time in his life, Ron felt happy. Mark encouraged him every chance he got and even bought him the most powerful personal computer on the market. Ron spent most of his free time on the internet, reading everything he could get his hands on. He decided it would be interesting to learn other languages, and Mark bought him software to help him. Soon, Ron was fluent in several languages, including Russian, Greek, Spanish, and Latin. For fun, he learned Klingon, although it wasn't really a real language. Mark joined him, and soon they were conversing frequently in the language, much to the dismay of his family. "Dad, you're spoiling the boy," Ron's father, Bob, told Mark one day. "He needs to learn something useful, not spend his whole life in those books of his." "The boy is gifted, Bob," Mark said. "Maybe if you spent as much time with him as you do with other kids, you'd see that. Trust me, he'll get his way, and I'll do everything in my power to help him." Of course, all of this led to a few awkward moments at school. For example, when his teacher was discussing Shakespeare. "What's your favorite line from Hamlet?" she asked Ron one day in class. "Teich pag tahbe," Ron declared in perfect Klingon. Everyone stared at him in shock, thinking he had lost his mind. "What?" his teacher asked him. "To be or not to be," said Ron. Or, in the original Klingon, "to live or die." "I see," said the teacher. After class, the teacher kept Ron around while the other kids left, giggling. She scolded Ron for his prank and told him that if it happened again, he would be sent to the principal's office. "I'm sorry," Ron said, looking down at the floor. "What was that?" she asked. Ron pulled out a copy of Hamlet, translated into Klingon, and held it out to her. She smiled as she looked at it. "Please try to stick to the original version, okay?" she asked. "I will," Ron replied. Of course, Ron had already read the entire play, as well as several others written by the bard, since they were part of his grandfather's extensive library. Thanks to his photographic memory, he had already memorized them all by heart. If she asked, he would probably recount them all to her from memory. When he returned home after dinner, his parents and brothers teased him mercilessly about the incident. It was one of the few times he was angry. "Heglu h kak jajvam," he hissed when they wouldn't shut up. "What's that?" asked Lisa. He looked at her angrily. "Today is a good day to die," he said. Her eyes widened, and she slowly backed away from him. His brothers crawled aside as well, wondering if their little brother was crazy enough to act on his words. They stayed away from him for weeks after that. Mark continued to encourage Ron by buying him textbooks in various subjects. Ron was interested in chemistry and biology, thanks in part to Stevenson's story, so Mark bought as many textbooks on those subjects as he could. Watching his grandson, Mark realized that the boy was actually bored at school. He took every test his teachers gave him, many times without even studying. With connections on the school board, Mark arranged for Ron to take the high school diploma exams. It was time for the boy to take on a new challenge, he thought. "Are you sure about this?" asked Dr. Williams, the local superintendent. "Absolutely," Mark replied. "The boy is very gifted, has an extremely high IQ, and is frankly bored. Hell, he could probably teach those classes. I want him in an environment that will challenge him." "All right, Mark," Dr. Williams said. "Bring the boy in, and I'll administer the test myself. If he does well enough on it, I'll help you get him into college." Mark wasn't too surprised to hear that Ron had done well on the test in record time. "That's the damnedest thing I've ever seen," Dr. Williams said. "I gave him the hardest test I could, and look, not one red mark. He even wrote a 3-page essay on the chemistry portion of the test." "I'm not surprised in the least," Mark said. "Look, I took the liberty of talking to the Dean of Admissions at MIT, Dr. Williams said. "If it's okay with you, I'd like to see if we can admit him. It's a great school for both chemistry and biology." "Let's do it," Mark said. It took a little effort, but once the dean saw Ron's record, which included an IQ test, his activities at Mensa, and the test Dr. Williams had given him, he balked, and soon Ron was on his way to MIT. Ron and Mark were thrilled, but his family was not impressed. "So you think you're better than the others?" asked John, as Ron gathered his things. Ron looked at him. No, he said. Maybe a little smarter, but not better. Yeah, well, we'll see what studying books gets you, John said mockingly. George was more direct. Remember, George said, payback is a bitch. You'll get what you deserve one day. Ron ignored him and continued packing. His parents didn't say anything to him or even hug him goodbye. Lisa wasn't much better, but still hugged him. Ron walked out of the house with his things and tears in his eyes when Mark picked him up. Mark had planned to drive Ron to school for a few days. Why does my family hate me? Asked Ron to Mark as he drove. They don't hate you, Mark replied. They just don't understand you. I think you remind them of their own shortcomings. What do you mean, Grandpa? Asked Ron. You have a great intellect, Ron, said Mark. It scares them. It scares them and makes them feel inferior. Think of all the stories and books you've read. Surely you can understand. I guess I do, Grandpa, Ron said. Still, it would be nice to know that my family really loves me. Well, I love you, Mark said, and I'm damn proud of you. I know you're going to do great things one day. Thanks, Grandpa, Ron said. I love you too. So at age 14, Ron became a student at MIT, even though he was too young to drive. He studied hard and read everything he could get his hands on, memorizing everything by heart. Most of the other students avoided him, but some became good friends. Mark, who was very wealthy, set up a fund for Ron that paid for his tuition and all his expenses. He also arranged for Ron to receive a nice stipend each month. Ron read about investing and put some of what he learned into practice. As a result, he was well on his way to earning a good amount of money. When the time came, Ron used some of the money to buy a new car. Mark approved of Ron's initiative and gave him some tips he had learned over the years. While attending MIT, Ron did more than just study. Inspired by Stevenson's writings, he started his own private research project. Ron believed that science could solve all of humanity's problems and wondered if there was anything that could give physically handicapped people like him an advantage without turning the patient into a killing machine or an uncontrollable freak on steroids. Everything was only hypothetical at this point, but it was an idea he never gave up on. His research on the internet led him to the work of Dr. Franklin Steiner, who had made significant strides in the field. According to Steiner's basic hypothesis, each of us has different defense mechanisms that help us cope with extreme situations. Sometimes we resort to an alternate version of ourselves, which can be called an alter ego, if you will. This alter ego can manifest itself in many different ways. For example, a normally quiet, unassuming person can suddenly become exuberant, arrogant, and overbearing. Those who are unfamiliar with this person's behavior will suddenly have a very different opinion of him or her. As Steiner explained, each of us has an inner beast that slumbers within us. His treatment helps bring that beast out to help the patient cope with a particular situation. Once the source of stress was gone, the beast was gone, and the person could, in theory, go on with life as usual. In Ron's opinion, this could lead to the emergence of an inner Hyde, a being possessed by a thirst for destruction that nothing could contain. No, Ron decided, his solution needed to be more permanent, but without the destructive and potentially deadly side effects. Naturally, none of this was approved by the Food and Drug Administration, but Steiner claimed to have conducted several successful human trials. Nevertheless, Ron was intrigued by Steiner's work and vowed to visit him one day after high school graduation. By the age of 18, Ron had earned his first doctorate, and a year later, to everyone's surprise, his second. Ron also earned a black belt in karate, primarily because of the mental discipline and physical fitness he enjoyed so much. Mark, of course, was not surprised and celebrated all of his grandson's accomplishments. As always, Mark attended all of Ron's ceremonies. However, none of the others accompanied him. Ron wrote to his family several times while he was there, but never received a reply. They didn't even send anything for Christmas or his birthday, but Mark always did. Meanwhile, Ron sent out resumes to several companies and had several Skype interviews with potential employers. He received several job offers, but after careful consideration, he decided to accept an offer from a very large and reputable pharmaceutical company half an hour away from his home. The company not only had a huge research center, but also offered the best compensation package of any offer he had received. It was at this time that Ron met Nancy. Nancy, fresh out of high school, worked as a waitress at a diner that Ron liked to visit when he wanted to get off campus. She was always so nice to him, and he found that he was very attracted to her. It took quite some time, but he finally worked up the courage to ask her out, and to his surprise, she accepted. Now, she was impressed that such a young man could get a second doctorate from MIT. This was a man who was going somewhere, she thought. And, she thought, he would be the one who could get her out of the hellhole she found herself in. She'd fallen in love with him over time, but even more, she loved the very thought that she could latch on to such a successful man. Of course, Ron didn't know that at the time, and had managed to fall in love with her too, and was shocked when she accepted his marriage proposal. This was helped greatly by the large diamond ring he proposed. Mark was delighted to hear the news, not only that Ron had gotten his dream job, but that he was getting married. "Ron, you know you have a lot of assets to think about," he said. "I'm sure Nancy is a nice girl, but I really think you should get a prenup to protect yourself." "You're right, Grandpa," Ron said. "I hadn't thought of that." "Tell you what, son," he said. "I'll have my lawyer set something up for you, okay?" "That's great, thanks," Ron said. Mark's lawyer drew up an agreement that was fair to both parties, but protected Ron's finances in the event of a divorce. It also spelled out what would happen in the event of infidelity. After rereading it, Ron presented it to Nancy. "What is it?" she asked. "It's called a prenup," Ron said. "It's designed to protect both of us in the event of a divorce. I'm not planning anything, but you know that about half of all marriages end in divorce." "Well, okay," she said, and signed the papers. Ron sent the papers back to Mark. Now he had everything ready. He would graduate soon, take Nancy home, marry her, then go to Hawaii for his honeymoon, and come back to start a new life with a new job and a new wife. Mark, meanwhile, bought a nice two-story house with a full basement for Ron and his new bride. Ron offered to pay for it, but Mark refused, calling it a wedding gift. Mark knew that Ron had always wanted a basement that he could turn into a home lab. The next few months flew by for Ron. After getting his second doctorate, he took Nancy out of the apartment she shared with her older sister. Other than clothes, Nancy had nothing, not even a car. She rode a small scooter everywhere. Ron loaded her things, including the scooter, into the U-Haul trailer with everything else and headed home. Nancy's eyes widened when she saw the house Mark had bought for them. She had never lived in such a beautiful home before. Ron was impressed. The house was nice, but not too extravagant, with a nice yard and a covered porch. Mark had even bought some new furniture for them to start living in. They unloaded the car and quickly put everything in its place. Ron put the scooter in the garage and promised to buy his new wife a car when they got back from Hawaii. A couple days later, Ron took Nancy to meet Mark and his family at his parents' house. Ron didn't know what to expect since it had been so long since he had heard from them. Mark hugged them both and greeted Nancy. Ron's parents kept to themselves and didn't say much to him other than commenting on how thin he was. They did, however, hug Nancy and greeted her as well. "I was hoping to see something from you guys while I was gone," Ron said. "It's been what, 4 or 5 years? I know I sent you guys my address." "I'm sorry," Ron's father said. "You know I'm not a fan of writing." "Not even a Christmas card?" asked Ron. "We're just so busy we forget," said Ron's mother. "We're not really into sending out cards and stuff. You know how it is." "Yeah, I think so," Ron said. His siblings entered the room. George and John nodded to Ron and looked at Nancy. Both of them looked like miniature copies of his father in their beat-up shirts and dirty jeans. Neither of them seemed to have shaved recently, and they had a slight stubble. "Oh well," George said with a smirk. "The little bugger's found himself a girlfriend." He walked over to Nancy and seemed to be examining her. "She's cute." Knock it off, you two, he said. Show some respect for your brother's fiancé. He turned to Bob. Your mom will be very disappointed if she sees this. Bob grimaced and looked at the floor. Big Daddy is sticking up for Brainiac as usual, John said. I guess some things never change. Well, if you two show a little initiative, I'll help you the way I helped Ron, Mark said. And the way I helped Lisa. But you seem content to push a broom and a mop bucket around. Ron looked at his two older brothers. What? He asked with a smile. You two are janitors? Really? After all that talk about you being football stars? Don't tell me you still live at home, right? Hey, college boy, it helps pay the bills, said George. Where's Lisa? Asked Ron to his mother. She moved out a while ago, said Ron's mother. She got an apartment and is going to study to be a nurse. She asked me to give you her contact information. She still lives in town. She handed Ron a card with Lisa's phone number and address written on it. So, I hear you found a job, Bob said, turning to Ron. Yeah, Ron replied. I'll be working as a researcher in a pharmaceutical lab. Bob nodded his head. Good, Bob said. I'm happy for you. I really am. So, are you guys coming to the wedding? Asked Ron. Or are you going to miss it too? We'll be there, said his mother. Ron looked at his brothers in disgust. Don't forget to shower, shave, and put on clean clothes, he told them. George looked at Ron with hatred in his eyes. Remember what I told you when you left, you mudblood, he said. He looked at Nancy with an evil smirk on his face. I never forgot, Ron said. Remember, I have a photographic memory. He turned and gestured for Nancy to leave. It's really good to see you, Ron, his mother said as he left. Ron just nodded his head as he walked out of the house. I'm really sorry about what happened, Mark said as he walked outside. I should have warned you. I thought that after all this, they would at least treat you with respect. I don't know if I want them to come to the wedding, I said. There's no way I can let that happen. Ron, they're your family, Mark said. Good, bad, or indifferent. Is that what I'm going to get from Lisa too? Asked Ron. Mark shook his head. No, said Mark. She's grown a lot since you left. I think you'll be surprised. I'll talk to you later. I need to talk to these people and get the situation under control. He looked at Nancy and hugged her. Please forgive them, he said. After Ron and Nancy got into his car, they drove off. Is this what you had to grow up with? She asked. Ron nodded his head. Yeah, but it wasn't that bad, Ron said. I don't know what happened. When they got home, Ron pulled out his cell phone and called the number he had for Lisa. She answered on the second ring. Lisa, it's Ron, he said. Ronnie, she exclaimed. Are you home now? Yes, I'm home, he said. Listen, I'm not that far from your house. Do you mind if I come over for a few minutes? She asked. Sure, he replied. Great, Lisa said. I'll be there before you know it. Do you know where I live? He asked. Yes, I was with Grandpa when he picked out a place for you. I hope you like it, she said. Yeah, I like it, Ron said. Good, she said. I'll see you in a few minutes. About 15 minutes later, Ron saw a red Toyota pull into the driveway. Lisa got out of the car, carrying her bag, and walked toward the front door. Ron was ahead of her and had already opened the door. Lisa put the bag on the floor and hugged Ron tightly. Ron was surprised, but hugged her back anyway. It's so good to see you again, Ronnie, she said. It's good to see you too, Lisa, he replied. He introduced her to Nancy and the two girls hugged. Welcome to the family, Nancy, Lisa said. It's nice to meet you. Me too, Nancy replied. Lisa handed Ron a package. He looked inside, found a glass baking dish with something inside, and looked at his sister again. It's nothing special, but I thought you might want to try the tuna casserole, Lisa said. I know you loved that dish when you were a kid. She still is, Ron said. Thanks. It will save us from having to cook on our first day here. Please come in and have a seat. He carried the casserole into the kitchen and put it in the refrigerator. Would you like something to drink? Coca-Cola? Coffee? Water would be fine for me, Lisa said. Me too, Nancy said. Please. Sure, Ron said, grabbing 3 bottles of water. He carried them back and sat down next to his fiancée. You look good, Lisa, Ron said. Is everything going well? Yes, she replied. I'm studying to be a nurse and working part-time at the hospital. I have a student loan and my grandfather set up a fund to help me with rent and utilities, so I'm doing well. I heard you found a good job. Yes, I did, Ron said. I'll start working right after we get back from our honeymoon. I'm so glad to hear that, she said. She hesitated for a moment. Have you been inside the house yet? Yeah, we just got back from there a little while ago, Ron said. What's going on? I haven't heard from anyone in about 5 years. And when I get home, I feel like they just don't care. Mom and Dad weren't doing so well, she said. About a year after you left, the factory closed and Dad lost his job. The only thing he could find was a janitorial position. Then the boys got injured playing football and lost their scholarships. So they went to work with their dad, doing nighttime janitorial work. After graduation, Mom and Dad said they could stay and turn the basement into an apartment if they didn't mind participating in the household. And they agreed. And that's why you left home? Asked Ron. Well, that was the beginning, she said. I didn't want to work with the boys as a cleaner. I always wanted to be a nurse, but Dad said he couldn't afford the training. Grandpa helped me get a student loan and got me settled so I could get out of there. You couldn't have stayed home? Asked Ron. She shook her head. No, she said. You know boys have always been assholes. I'm sorry, she said, looking at Nancy. I've heard worse, said Nancy. Lisa continued. Well, they renovated the basement for the boys, Lisa said. And all 3 of them, Dad, John, and George, turned into even bigger assholes. Grandpa offered to help the boys, but all they want to do is play ball and chase the girls. Then I caught them bringing the girls down to the basement. A couple times I even saw Daddy join them. The place would stink to high heaven. I couldn't stand it and left. And Mom let it go on? Asked Ron. She wasn't thrilled about it, but after Dad told her off, she stopped saying anything, said Lisa. I think she's afraid of losing their income if she divorces Dad. She was silent for a moment, and Ron realized that she had something else on her mind, but she didn't want to share it. Ron decided not to bring it up yet. Then she looked at Nancy. Look, I'll be free tomorrow afternoon, she said. Do you want to go shopping? Maybe we can get what you need for the wedding. That sounds like fun, Nancy said. But I don't have that much money. Don't worry, Ron said. I'll give you my credit card. Just don't squeeze all the money out of it, okay? Nancy and Lisa giggled. I'll try, Nancy said with a smile. They spent the next day shopping for dresses and all the things women want for a wedding. Nancy had her hair and nails done, and the girls enjoyed a delicious meal. Late in the afternoon, they finally made it home, and Ron was overwhelmed by all the packages he had carried out of Lisa's car. He also noted that both girls seemed to get along well with each other, and that pleased him. I'll take you shopping for your tuxedo tomorrow afternoon, big boy, Lisa told Ron. Ron looked at her in surprise. Big boy, he asked himself. Where did that come from? Well, okay, he said. The next day she arrived around 1 o'clock, and they went into town where Ron was picked up a tuxedo. On the way, Lisa noticed that Ron was constantly looking around, nervous about something. What is it, Ron? She asked. I'm just waiting for something to pop out and cover me in indelible ink or something, he replied. She laughed. You think I'd do that to you? She asked. You would have done it before I went to college, he said. She looked away embarrassed. Was I really that bad to you? She asked. All of you were, he said. You weren't as bad as George and John, but you always seemed to agree with everything they did. I could never understand why you all hated me so much. I'm sorry, Ron, she said. I never hated you, and I'm sorry if you got that impression. Then why? Asked Ron. Why were you all so hateful to me? I can't speak for the boys, she said. I was a little jealous of you, and I practically followed George and John. Now that you mention it, I think I've been rather bad to you. But that's all in the past now. I'd like to get to know the real you, if you don't mind. Bury the hatchet, so to speak. So, who are you, and what have you done to my sister? And why are you jealous of me? Asked Ron, laughing. She laughed along with him. You've always been so smart, she said. And Grandpa always stood up for you. I remember you spending a lot of time reading his books. You couldn't get enough of all those books in his library. And when you started talking to each other in Klingon, I felt a connection between you that neither of us had. Do you still do that? Speaking Klingon? Ron laughed. Not so often anymore, he said. But it's been fun. Believe me, you haven't really gotten to know Shakespeare until you've read him in Klingon, he added, referring to a line from a scene in the movie Star Trek. They both laughed, remembering this incident from his high school days. After his fitting, they stopped for a snack and continued their conversation. Nancy seems like a very nice girl, Lisa said. I'm glad you found someone who loves you. Thanks, he said. What about you? Is there a Mr. Right in your life? Sort of, she replied. I'm seeing someone right now. I don't know where it's going to lead, but things are good right now. I got the impression yesterday that there was something else going on with you, Ron said. Is everything okay with your family? Did something happen? Lisa lowered her eyes, her face slightly flushed. Yeah, but I'm not ready to talk about it right now, she said. I'm just glad Grandpa was there for me. Ron nodded his head understandingly. Well, if you feel like talking about it, I'll be around, he said. Lisa smiled, looking at him. Thanks, Ron, she said. I probably will. The wedding went well for Ron and Nancy. Her sister had come from the East and acted as maid of honor. Ron's best man was an old high school friend of his. Mark happily walked Nancy down the aisle. When the time came, Ron lifted her veil and kissed her for the first time as her husband. Ron felt a slightly bitter taste during the kiss, but put it out of his mind. It was probably just nerves, he thought. The reception, for the most part, went well too. Ron danced with his new bride, of course, followed by his mother and Lisa. George, John, and his father danced with Nancy too. As they sat at the table, Ron was approached by his brothers. George said, Well, what? You've really done it. You really tied the knot. He looked at Nancy and grabbed his crotch. Remember, if you want a real man, look for me, he told her with a smirk on his face. John grinned as well. Ron, however, was not in the mood for jokes and stood up from his chair. George looked at him. Are you going to play it cool, Mudblood? If you want to play, just let me know. Just stay away from me, Ron said calmly, looking George straight in the eye and clenching his fists. George seemed to sense a change in his little brother and prudently decided not to push the issue. Hey, I'm just kidding, he said, smiling. He turned and, waving to John, walked out of the reception area. At that moment, Lisa walked over and gave her brother a hug. I'm really so happy for you, Ron, she said. Don't mind those idiots. Thank you, Lisa, he said. She turned to Nancy, hugged her, and kissed her cheek. Nancy returned the favor. When Lisa left, Bob and June walked over to them. Bob smiled and shook Ron's hand. You did good, son, he said. I'm happy for you. Congratulations. Thanks, Dad, Ron said. Bob smiled as he hugged Nancy. Welcome to the family, he told her. She hugged him back and thanked him while June hugged Ron. I'm so happy for you two, June said to Ron. Congratulations. Thank you, Mom, Ron said. She hugged and kissed Nancy, who hugged her back. Mark also expressed his best wishes. I'm so proud of you, son, he said. You have a good woman. Take good care of her. I will, Grandpa, Ron said. Thanks for everything. Mark hugged Nancy too and welcomed her to the family. After that, Ron and Nancy went to the house. They planned to stay there overnight and then fly to Hawaii for their honeymoon in the early morning. Upon their return, Ron went to work and was soon immersed in developing new and better drugs to help treat the sick. At the same time, he began setting up his own home laboratory so that he could conduct personal research. About 2 months after returning from Hawaii, Nancy approached him about going to school to get a nursing degree. "I think that's a great idea," Ron said. "Why don't you go to the college where Lisa goes and enroll? Don't worry about the cost. Just bring me the paperwork and I'll take care of everything." She wrapped her arms around him and kissed him. "Oh, thank you so much," she exclaimed. "I'll go tomorrow." Lisa said registration starts soon, so I'll sign up. I think she said a 2-year degree costs about $18,000. Is that okay? "Sure," Ron said. "And if you decide to go further than the 2-year course, let me know." "You're the best husband in the world," she said. "Thank you, thank you, thank you. Just wait until tonight." Ron smiled. "I'll keep you posted," he said. For the next year and a half, Nancy focused on her studies. Many classes were in the evenings, and she told Ron that she and some of the other students would get together to study after school. Ron looked at her textbooks and realized that she had a lot to learn in a short time, so he made do with missing classes as best he could and helped his wife with cooking and housework. In the evenings when she wasn't home, he also worked on his own project. By this time, he had a fully equipped home laboratory and had made considerable progress in his research. After testing a few formulas on lab rats, he decided that he was close to starting human trials. He pondered this for a while before he decided to test the formula on himself. Not surprisingly, the formula worked. A few days after injecting himself with a very small dose of the formula, Ron noticed a noticeable change in himself. His muscle mass increased by about 3%, and he felt more confident than ever before. Unfortunately, the physical changes only lasted a few hours. Ron realized that he would have to either increase the dose or continue injecting himself every day, perhaps several times a day. But he wondered, what would be the end result? At this time, Ron also noticed that the frequency of amusement between him and Nancy had decreased significantly. Ron realized that her studies were stressful and required a lot of studying, but she seemed to be spending more nights out than at home. And he realized she often didn't get home until midnight or later. She had also become more irritable toward him over the past few months. When he mentioned the decreasing frequency of their entertainment, she would get upset and say that all her time was being taken up by her studies. She always looked tired and complained of headaches. One evening when Nancy wasn't home, he decided to talk to Lisa about it. By this time, she had graduated and was working full-time at the hospital. "Lisa," he said, "could you shed some light on this? She seems to leave almost every night before midnight or later. I know the program is complicated, but does it really take up that much of your time?" "Oh yes," she said. "It's a very challenging program, and there's a tremendous amount of information dumped on you in a very short period of time. I spent quite a few late nights in the common area studying with my classmates. Why do you ask? Do you suspect she's doing something else?" "I don't know," Ron said. "I don't want to falsely accuse her of something." "Smart move, little brother," she said. "And I'm not being condescending to you. In fact, I'm glad you felt you could talk to me first. Remember, not everyone is as smart as you are." "I guess you're right," he said. "Is everything okay with you?" she asked. "She's been very irritable lately, and our alone time has almost come to zero," he said. "Yeah, I can see how that could happen," Lisa said. "Just be patient, Ron. She's going through a lot right now and she needs your support. Just hang in there. Things will get better. You'll see." "I hope you're right," he said. "Thanks for taking the time to talk to me." "Any time, little brother," she said with a smile. A couple weeks later, Ron and Nancy were at a company meeting. Ron was talking to several coworkers, but when he looked around, he didn't see Nancy. "Where is she?" he asked himself. She had been here just a short time ago. He walked around, looking for her, but didn't see her anywhere. A few hours later, he saw her walking toward him. He headed towards her, feeling relieved that he had found her. "Where have you been?" he asked. "I've been looking all over for you." "Oh, a couple of your coworkers gave me a little tour of the place," she said. "Very impressive. I can see now why you like to spend so much time here." Things went back to normal, and 2 weeks later a friend gave him the bad news. Ron put his head down in his arms and cried that his marriage was ruined. How many other guys had she slept with since they started dating, he wondered. He pulled out his phone and called the only person who could help him cope. "Hey son, what's up?" asked Mark, picking up the phone. "Grandpa, I think Nancy is cheating on me," Ron said. "Come over and let's talk, son," said Mark. Ron finished talking and went to his grandfather's house. Mark listened intently as Ron told him what he had learned. "What should I do, Grandpa?" asked Ron. "I don't know where to start." "Well then," said Mark, "it's time for you to use your big brain. The first thing we need to do is get some evidence to present in court. Once we have that, you can go to a lawyer and file for divorce. Do you still have the prenup?" "Yes, I do," Ron said. Mark nodded his head. "Maybe the court will schedule counseling for you," Mark said. "Do you think you can get through this and reconcile with her?" Ron shook his head. "I don't think so, Grandpa," he said. "She's been a total bitch to me lately, and she goes well past midnight almost every night." "Well, we may have to hire a private investigator to keep an eye on her," Mark said. "I know a couple good ones in the neighborhood, so I'll take care of that. Do you have the spare house key I gave you?" Ron pulled out a key fob and handed Mark the extra house key. "We'll need to get the house wired for audio and video in case she does something at home. What time does she usually leave for class?" "I think this semester her first class starts at 11:30 a.m., Ron said. "She takes a full load and studies until about 9:30 p.m. and then supposedly studies until late at night. I talked to Lisa, and she said that's not too unusual considering her classes." Mark said. "We'll know the truth soon enough. In the meantime, you need to stay calm. Try to act normal with her. Don't get confrontational with her or start accusing her until we have proof. And don't do anything stupid." "I won't," Ron said. "You know, I'm glad to hear you're talking to Lisa," Mark said. "Maybe you should spend more time with her. She's really matured since she left home." "Did something happen to her at home?" asked Ron. "Yes," said Mark. "But I'm not sure what exactly. Don't stir things up. She'll tell you herself when she's ready." "Okay, I got it," said Ron. Mark put his arm around Ron. "Now get home and try to act normal around Nancy," Mark said. "I'll call and see if we can't start tomorrow. I'll let you know what's going on. I'm really sorry to hear that. I thought Nancy was a wonderful girl. It's hard for me to imagine that she could do that to you. But don't worry. Whatever we find out, we'll get through it." "Thank you, Grandpa," Ron said before leaving. When he got home, he noticed that Nancy was still gone, which was not uncommon these days. A thought occurred to him, and he took a small webcam from his stash and set it up in the bedroom, figuring that if anything happened there, he would catch it. It was small enough that Nancy didn't notice it right away. The camera activated on movement and started recording if there was anything going on in the room. He went down to the lab and checked the camera's operation, then got to work on his personal project to keep himself busy. After checking on the condition of his test rats, he noticed that the latest modification of his formula lasted longer than the previous ones, and, even better, didn't cause any negative side effects. He did some calculations and decided to test it on himself again. He knew it was risky, but felt it had to be done. First, he measured his vitals: pulse, respiration, oxygen levels, and blood pressure, and then administered a small dose of the drug. It took about 45 minutes before he felt the familiar burning sensation that told him the drug was working. He recorded the readings again and was relieved to see that they were still within normal limits. He went to the back of the lab where his gym equipment was stored. He changed into shorts and a t-shirt and started practicing on the punching bag. After spending quite a bit of time on the bag, he found that his strength and stamina had increased significantly. He took a quick shower and headed upstairs, locking the doors to his lab. By his calculations, It would be about a half hour before Nancy returned home. Today, however, she surprised him and came home 15 minutes earlier than usual. "Hello, stranger," he said as she walked in. "Glad to see you home early for a change. I bet if I'm going to be greeted like that for coming home early, I'm going to start doing it every night," she said. "Where did that come from?" "I just miss you, that's all," he said. "How's school going?" "Good," she said. "It's been mostly quizzes. Tests are coming up soon." "Well then," he said, "why don't we go over something else?" "Like what?" she asked. "Like about our night," he said as he walked up the stairs. "You mean," she began. "Uh-huh," he said. "Are you sure you didn't take anything?" she asked. "You look, well, I don't know, different." "Diet and exercise," he said. "We don't see each other that often, so naturally I seem a little different to you." "Like this?" she asked. "Honestly, I don't remember it being like that. But I'm not complaining." "I'm glad," he said. Maybe, he thought to himself, it would keep her from failing. Or maybe it wouldn't. At least it would give her something to think about. "You know, you're the only woman I need." He felt her flinch slightly, probably from guilt. "And you're the only man I need," she said. "Really?" he asked. She looked at him in surprise. Does he really know? She asked herself. Of course he does, Ron, she said. I love you. And only you. I'm glad to hear that, he said. I love you too. And only you. My heart would break if anything changed. She flinched slightly when he said that and pulled him tighter against her. It would break my heart too, she said quietly. He kissed her forehead. Why don't we take the weekend and get away from everything for a while, he said. Maybe reconnect with each other. I'd like that, she said. Maybe at the end of the semester. I have exams coming up, and I really need to study. I understand, he said. Just remember, if there's anything I can do to help, let me know. Thanks, kiddo, she said. I will. I think we should get some sleep, he said. I need to get to the office a little early. Sounds good, she said. Have a good night. I love you. Good night, sweetheart, he said. I love you too. Don't forget I'll be home pretty late tonight. I have a lot of studying to do. She said the next morning. I understand. Don't be late, he said, smiling. She smiled back. I'll try, she said. In the afternoon, he received a text from Mark. Connected and ready to go. Private investigator on the case. Got it, he texted back. Part 2. After a fairly productive day at work, Ron returned home and logged onto his lab computer to see if his webcam had captured anything. It had successfully captured his date with her the night before. He fast-forwarded through it all and hoped there was nothing more to it. In his mind, the only thing that should have been captured was her getting ready for school and changing the sheets on the bed. But the camera captured something else. About 30 minutes after he left, the camera came back on as Nancy entered the room, followed by his father and 2 brothers. What the hell are they doing there? He puzzled. Nancy sat down on the bed and all 3 men undressed. I don't think I can do this tonight, guys, she said into the video. Why the hell not? Asked George. Things have changed, she said. What do you mean things have changed? Asked John. I don't know exactly, but I think Ron suspects something, she said. What exactly? Bob asked. Yeah, like what? Chimed in George. You didn't see him last night, she told them. He was a completely different person. What did you let him do? Asked John. After we specifically asked you to keep him away for a week? I had no choice, she said. He was like a kinder version of you guys, she said. He was more confident. He's doing something in his lab, Bob said. We have to get in there and figure it out. No, you can't do that, Nancy said. He has a lot of security doors, and if anyone tries to get in, it will alert him and the police. Do you know what he's working on? Asked George. Nancy shook her head. I have no idea, she said. So what? We're just going to forget about our plan to make him raise the baby thinking it's his? Asked John. I think we should put that plan on hold for now, she said. First, I want to finish school and get settled. Once I have a job with benefits, we can revisit the issue. Screw this shit, George said. I don't want to wait that long. He looked at his father. Maybe we should go with Plan B. Bob nodded his head. Nancy looked at them. What do you mean by Plan B? She asked. Deal with him directly, John said. Yeah, and we'll get it all on tape, said George. We'll see how long that brainiac lasts at work when we send out the tape to his boss and co-workers. All three men laughed. You can't be serious, Nancy said. Oh yes, we're damn serious, John said. And you're going to help us set it up. What? Asked Nancy. You want me to set him up? Yes, said George. And if I don't want to? She asked. Then we'll just tell him about your wedding day, said John. All three men laughed. Then we'll show him the video. Do you think he'll ever want to touch you again? Nancy lowered her eyes in embarrassment. What about your grandfather? Asked Nancy. He'll never let you get away with anything. Yes, said George. He's got a mortgage on the house. He'll have us on the street or in jail in no time. Let me worry about Big Daddy, Bob said. George and John nodded their heads. So, bitch, John said, are you in, or do we need to take you to the other side of town? Just don't touch him, please, she cried. When do you want to do it? Soon, George said. I'll let you know. In the meantime, you play the good, loving wife while we get everything ready. We don't want the little runt to get suspicious. Understand? Nancy nodded her head, a tear rolling down her cheek. I understand, she said quietly. Good, George said. Nancy was finally left alone, and while Ron watched, she buried her head in her hands and sobbed. The video ended when she finally got up and went to the bathroom. Ron copied it to a flash drive and, realizing that he had just witnessed a crime in progress, pulled out his phone to call the police and warn Mark. But he never got the chance to call. The phone rang while he was holding it. He saw that Lisa was calling and answered it. Ron, thank God I found you, she said. You need to get to the hospital right away. What's wrong, Lisa? He asked. It's Grandpa, she said. He's been shot. He's already been operated on, but things don't look good. Please hurry up and get here. I'll meet you at the emergency room. They finished talking and Ron ran up the stairs, closing the doors to the lab. He made it to the hospital as fast as he could and met Lisa in the emergency room. She took his hand and led him to the ICU where Mark lay. His eyes were closed and his breathing was ragged. There were tubes and wires attached to his body, and Ron could see that his vital signs were out of whack. What's wrong? He asked Lisa. According to the police, he was caught in a shootout between two rival gangs, she said. He's been hit several times. It doesn't look good. Ron agreed and started watching the indicators. He pulled a chair over and sat down next to Mark and Lisa. She put her head on his shoulders and cried. Ron put his arm around her and tried to comfort her. Suddenly, Mark twitched in his bed. Ron and Lisa looked at his vitals and recognized the signs of a heart attack. Suddenly, a code blue announcement sounded and the room quickly filled with medical personnel. Ron and Lisa stood back as they worked, but all was to no avail. They watched Mark's vitals drop, and nothing the technicians did helped. The doctor examined him one last time and wrote down the time of Mark's death in a folder. They disconnected him from the medical equipment and pulled a sheet over his face and then left. Ron was kneeling over Mark, hot tears streaming down his face. Lisa sobbed with him, placing her hand on Ron's shoulder. As Ron mourned for his grandfather, a rage grew in him. Ron felt his whole body shaking with emotion, and he was overcome with the urge to kill. The rage continued to build up in him until he couldn't take it anymore. Suddenly, he threw his head back and let out a blood-chilling scream. Lisa recoiled from him, shocked. Several nurses came running to see what was going on, but by then, Ron had calmed down. I need to get out of here, Ron said. I'll call tomorrow. Please call, Lisa said fearfully. She had never seen Ron in this state before and was very worried about him. Ron walked out of the curtained room and headed for the door. He was met outside by his father and brothers. What's wrong? Asked Bob. Ron grabbed him by the collar and slammed him against a nearby truck with hatred in his eyes. Like you don't know? He asked. Bob shook his head. He had never seen Ron so physically strong before. No, I don't know, he said. I honestly don't know. If I ever find out you had anything to do with Grandpa getting shot, so help me God, I don't know what I'll do to you, he growled. No, please, Ron. Trust me, I had nothing to do with it, he pleaded. Ron plowed him back down to the ground, and with his peripheral vision saw George start to swing at him. It never hit its target as Ron brought him down with a punch to the face. Ron looked at John with anger in his eyes. You want pain too, asshole? Growled Ron. John shook his head, his eyes widening. He stretched his arms out in front of him. Who is this lunatic? He thought, looking at his little brother. No, Ron, please. No more, he said. Then stay away from me, Ron said. He looked at Bob. Are you going to take care of your father's funeral, or am I going to have to do it for you? I'll take care of it, Bob said, standing up. I'm sorry, Ron. I really am. I know how much your grandfather meant to you. I'll take care of everything. You better, Ron said before he left. He called his boss at work and asked for parental leave. I'm sorry, Ron, his boss said. Go ahead and take the next 5 days off. We've got it covered. Thanks, boss, Ron said, and ended the conversation. He got in his car and drove home, thinking about his revenge. He swore they would all pay for what they had done to him. As he drove, part of his mind went over formulas and calculations, while the other part of his mind focused on driving. It was something he had mastered some time ago, and now it had become second nature to him. His face contorted into a wicked grin as a plan popped into his head. Oh yeah, he thought to himself, all those bastards will pay for their treachery. Back home, he turned off all the cameras and went to his lab, formulas swarming in his head. He immediately got to work, knowing he didn't have much time. He checked something from his previous experiments and his extensive computer library and made the necessary adjustments. The first solution just had to work, because there was no time to check or reformulate. He worked like a man possessed until he finally got the composition he was looking for. Looking around, he found one more thing that should have made his job easier and set it aside. He took something that looked like a turkey basin and sucked in a hefty dose of the solution he had just created, then set it aside. Now, all that was left was to wait. He didn't have to wait long. He heard Nancy's car pull into the garage. Grabbing what he needed, he ran up the stairs and into the kitchen. He poured Nancy a glass of sherry, knowing she would want to drink it before bed. He turned around with the glass in his hands as Nancy entered the house from the garage. Is that for me? She asked, reaching for the glass. Sure, he replied, holding out the glass to her. How was your day? Pretty damn busy, she sighed, sipping from her glass. We've been reviewing everything for. She dropped the glass and nearly fell to the floor, but Ron caught her before she passed out. He applied the cure. Perfectly. He went downstairs and plopped down on the futon in his lab. End of part 1. Part the 2nd of May be coming out in 12 hours. Write in the comments if you're waiting for it. Also, give a like under this video and subscribe to my channel. I hope you enjoyed this video.